Hi everyone, welcome. Welcome to another Ironhack webinar. Today we're going to talk about coding, but don't worry, if you're a beginner, you'll be able to follow everything. And for those of you who are new here, my name is Raquel. I work at Ironhack in the growth team, to be accurate. But if it's the first time that you're hearing about us, we are a global tech school. We have bootcamps on data analytics, on UX, UI design, cybersecurity, and of course, web development. I did the bootcamp myself. So if you're looking to know more about us and know a bit more about our bootcamps or what do we do, we have some useful links that you can use here below the videos on the green button. So if you want to see a little bit about what we do, please follow them. And we have here Thomas and Malcolm to host the webinar today. But before we go, I just want to explain you a little bit about Crowdcasts to know how we're going to manage these today. So after I stop talking, they will be presenting, but in the end, we will have time for a few questions. So if you are following but still have a few questions, Malcolm will be answering during the webinar, but in the end, we will answer them live, the remaining questions or a bit more generic questions. Okay, so if you want to make your questions for during the webinar or even after, you can leave them on the Ask a Question section. You can see here below the videos. It's going to be easier for us to manage and you can vote other people's questions. Okay? But if you want to engage, if you want to leave us your comments, actually, I would love to know where you're seeing us from. In the chats, you have. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think you're back now, yeah.
Am I back now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I hope you didn't lose everything that I said, but I was just saying that you can leave your comments in the chat, and I would love to know where you're seeing us from. Perfect. The good news is that I will not be the one hosting the webinar, so hopefully everything will go well from now on. So if you feel like the video is not working or the sound is not working, please leave that on the chat as well, and we try to solve these as quickly as possible. But in any case, ask a question covered. You can leave here your comments in the chat, and the webinar is recorded. So if you need to review this at any point after it's over, or if you need to look at the links that we share in here, you can do so in the same link that you're here right now. Okay? I believe that we're all covered, right? I hope I didn't miss anything while I was out. But I'll pass the word to you guys.
All right. Well, good evening from the Netherlands. It's around 6 o'clock here, Central European time. Let me start sharing my screen first. And let me show you the lecture that I would like to present. All right. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Thomas. I'm a web developer based in Amsterdam. I have worked in a startup here in Amsterdam as a full stack JavaScript developer. And I did a bootcamp, full stack JavaScript bootcamp myself in 2017. So I've been in the boat where some of you might be soon in the Ironhack environment. And since that moment, I worked as a web developer for a company, and I also taught in several courses. Today, I would like to talk with you about writing clean code, and I'm going to do that together with Malcolm. And perhaps Malcolm would like to say a word or two about himself before we start.
Oh, yeah. Hi, everybody. Malcolm. Also, good evening from the Netherlands. Yeah, a few things about myself. This is always awkward. I am a developer. I have been developing for, let's say, the past 4 to 5 years. Originally from Sweden, moved here about 2 years ago. I've worked as a back-end developer. I've worked as a front-end developer. I've also worked as a full stack developer, both on like startups and even to like mid to corporate, we could say, companies. Currently, I'm teaching at Ironhack. Yeah, and when I'm not coding, I'm dancing. So That's me in a nutshell. I'll be answering most of the questions while Thomas is having the lecture. So yeah, see you in the chat.
Awesome, Malcolm. Thank you so much for the introduction. Can everybody see my screen? Could anybody confirm that?
Yes.
Awesome. All right. All right. So today we're going to talk about clean code. I want to give a short introduction about well, the context of clean code. Then I would like to treat the question why I care about clean code. And after that, we're just going to dive into a few rules and practices that might help a developer to write code that is more readable and more minimal, more maintainable, to name it in one word, that code that is more clean. Then I would like to spend a word or two on clean code in the real world. How does that look like at a company, for example? And I also added to this slide, don't be offended or don't feel offended if you feel this makes total sense, because several rules that I'm going to tell you are actually quite obvious. And I feel that most people are aware of the importance of these rules and of the logic behind them. But there's still a difference of being aware or somewhere in your mind knowing that it's important on the one hand and implementing these principles on the other hand. And yeah, I hope this lecture will contribute to more practical awareness, let's say, when it comes to clean code. So let's first start with the question, why worry about code? I questioned this myself because I proposed to talk about clean code. And then I thought, but hey, there's this quote by this famous developer. He's called Linus Torvalds, which some of you probably know. He's the creator of Linux. He is like a major authority in the field. And he once said the following: the difference between a bad programmer and a good one is whether he considers his code or his data structures more important. And the conclusion of this quote for many people, and also which is explained by himself, is that he believes data structures are more important than code. Well, you might wonder, what the hell are data structures? Well, that's a very good question. The way I would now shortly describe it is it's the way how you design your application in terms of data building blocks and data processing. That's the most simple way I can tell you right now. One way to think about it is, for example, if you're going to build an application, you will store data in a database. You will have several, let's say, structures of data in that database. And the way you design that is actually very important also for the health of your application. So this is very important. And so I started questioning myself, hey, why talking about clean code? And I think the most obvious answer to this is that actually the quality of your code might be an expression of good awareness of data structures. But even if you are very well aware of your data structures, you might still screw up your code. And screwing up your code is very unfortunate for several reasons. It's unfortunate because you are less able to understand your own code. You also are less able to transmit it to your fellow developers. Like code that is not clean will also result in maybe worse programming. And there is something called the broken windows theory, which I think is applicable here. The more messy your code looks, the more sloppy you will deal with it. At least that's my theory around it. So that's the counter argument. And maybe more important to add to that is that at Ironhack, what we often see is that people are actually quite good at making something work. Okay, so you get an assignment usually, and there's usually already some code, and there's a defined input, there's a defined output, and then the assignment is, okay, create this output by changing the function that we're giving to you. And actually that works very often very well. But in that process, the way it is coded and the extent of readability, the degree of readability is not always, that's not always taken care of very well. And that's, I think, how we concluded that it's actually very important to talk about code. So having said that, having started with the counter argument, let's dive into that. What is clean code? There are multiple definitions of clean code. And I think this is one of my favorite definitions. And this definition is, this quote has been spoken by Grady Bush, which is the creator of the unified modeling language, which was a big thing in the mid-90s and early zeros. And the way he defined clean code is as follows. Clean code is simple and direct. Clean code reads like well-written prose. Clean code never obscures the designer's intent, but rather is full of crisp abstractions and straightforward lines of control. So yeah, let's let that sink in. Clean code is simple and direct. I think this is a very important sentence. It actually conveys that ideally code is very simple and maybe even minimal and basic and easy to understand. It's simple and direct. Clean code reads like well-written prose. I think this is also a very important sentence because it conveys that in the end, what we can achieve with code is that it literally transcends what's happening inside your computer. This sentence conveys that with code, we can actually make it usable for human users because human beings use the human language. Clean code never obscures the designer's intent, but is rather full of crisp abstractions and straightforward lines of control. And here we have, I think, 3 elements. It never obscures the designer's intent, which basically means if you see something written in code, you actually understand the intention of the author or the developer. It's full of crisp abstractions. I think this is very much related to the first sentence. Clean code is simple and direct. If we're working with crisp abstractions, it often means that we're lowering our amount of duplication, of redundant code. Everything that's double can be abstracted basically, and that's I think what Grady Bush means with the crisp abstractions. And the last thing, I think that's more of a subjective experience, but if you use code which is just well written and which is great to work with, that might actually feel like straightforward lines of control, like Grady Bush defines that. All right. So I think, yeah, that's the first thing that I would like to dive into, which is also what I defined in the beginning. So now I would like to discuss a few aspects of clean code based on subdomains of programming. So we have functions, we have naming, code formatting, comments, principles. So let's go there. And actually, I would like to ask, I hope Raquel agrees on that, could someone just tell me what a function is?
I think most people are muted, so I'm not sure you'll be able to get an answer.
Okay, then that's all right. Then I'll just present what I think a function is. So I think I found a quote. Usually when I have a question or I want a definition, I search for it on the internet, and this is a quote. Functions are one of the fundamental building blocks in JavaScript. A function in JavaScript is similar to a procedure, a set of statements that performs a task or calculated value. Well, I could go on describing the whole quote, but I don't think that's necessary. The way I see it is indeed a function is a building block in your code, and it helps you to store reusable code, and it also helps you to organize your code, because that reusable piece of code, you might want to use that much more often than just once. So I think the first question that is great to dive into right now is the question how to cleanly functionalize code. How to cleanly functionalize code. And just for the sake of making understandable what I'm talking about, because I know that most of you guys did not work a lot with, well, at least I know that you still want to start with bootcamp. So there is quite a chance that some of you guys never wrote a function or only a few times. So I think it wouldn't hurt to just give a quick reminder. And I'll do that in JavaScript because that's the language of the web. And well, I think that's also one of my favorite languages. So let's write a function, get square, number, return number times number. All right, so I just wrote a function called get square, and it basically takes a number as an argument, and it will return the square of that number. It's very straightforward. And now if I just give a number, let's see, say 5, the output is 25. I can use this in many ways. I can say I want it of 8, which is amazing, but I can also use an insanely large number, and it still calculates. So that's great. So that's a function, just a very short recap. And let's go back to the slides. Yeah, I think there are a few principles that are for now worth remembering. There are more. I think during your career as a developer, you will encounter more, and perhaps different concepts might be important later on. But for now, I think there are a few things that are relatively understandable and that will help you to organize your code in a better way. So I think the first thing that that is important with functions is that they are expected to be small if you want to write a clean coded function. So I think the 20 lines is actually regarded kind of the max for a function, according to Uncle Bob, which is another veteran from the industry. So I think that's kind of an idea, gives you kind of an idea of how big a function can be, or perhaps ideally is. But it doesn't have to stop there. You can basically think of a function as potentially having 3 lines. So, and one thing that's really important in JavaScript is that JavaScript is, it's a language, but it's also a library, because you can use a lot of built-in functionalities of that language. And so if I would like to share with you guys how to write clean code in JavaScript, it's indispensable to talk about higher order functions. And I don't want to do that very extensively right now, but I just want to give you one example just to plant a seed in your brain to show that it is actually something very handy. So let me go to, let me see. Can I place this here? No, not yet. Okay, let me just move this whole thing. All right. Yeah, you should be able to see my my code editor right now. Yes. All right. And let's start with the first, well, let's say aspect of clean coding a function, and that is by making it small. You might not understand everything what you're seeing here. If you don't, or if you're lost, please ask Malcolm. I hope you will not be too busy, Malcolm. But I'll try to understand. I'll try to make understandable what's happening here, and then I'll show you how this code can be made more minimal. So what's often used in programming languages, and especially also in JavaScript, is arrays. An array is basically a list of elements. So we have an array here containing 3 items, the numbers 1, 2, 3, and it's stored in a variable called R, which could be also numbers list, var numbers list. And perhaps what we can do now, let's see whether terminal, are we seeing the output here? No, I don't think we're seeing it. Well, in this case, I'm just going to do it in the because that's just possible. Let's go here. Let me see why this is not doing anything. Console log should return. Okay, this should return numbers list of length. Console log. Okay. Numbers list. Okay, let's try it again. So we're declaring the numbers list in the console. And now I also want you to loop numbers list of length. Oh, wait, that might be the problem. Yes, all right. So basically what's happening here is we are declaring an array with 3 items, which are 3 numbers. And we use something which is often used in JavaScript, which is called a for loop, which helps us to iterate over the elements in an array. And then we're using another functionality, which is called console.log, which helps us to see or log something in the console. So what we just did is we used a for loop, but in JavaScript, we have something a bit more elegant, which is called a higher order function called for each. So what we could also do is the following. And again, I don't expect you all to just understand this, but it might give you a sense of how you could minimize your code. Let's see, we have this. What we have on line 9 is the same as what we have on line 5 to 7. So let's execute this also in the browser, and we have the same. Yeah. So this is to give you an impression of the simplicity that a higher order function can give you in JavaScript. So we have a loop here, and instead of that whole construct with a lot of codey things like declaring a variable, declaring a condition, declaring something with plus incrementation, etc., you can make it even much easier, perhaps even if you're starting with programming, by just using a higher order function. Well, you might be wondering what the heck higher order functions. There is one website which I really like, which is called Mozilla Development Network, or developer.mozilla.org, which has great documentation on anything JavaScript. And basically, if you, for example, look for the for each, you will see the for each higher order function explained. And also here in the side column, you will see a lot of other methods that are in it to JavaScript, and which will help you to write more small functions and minimal code. So that's the first aspect of cleanly functionalizing code. A second part that is also important is that you can use functions to increase the readability of your code. So we already saw that with the for loop and like the for each method in relation to the for loop. But I would like to show you guys another example of how that's possible. So this requires a little bit of reading, so I'll go a bit slower over this. What we want to do is we want to, let's see, get to-dos. We want to get to-dos. So imagine we're working in an application. We have a to-do application wherein you can enter to-dos for today, and you can also delete those to-dos, or you can check them. There must be a function that basically says get to-dos or get specific to-dos. What we are going to do right now is we're going to get important to-dos. So let me just delete this because I don't think that's important. What we have here is basically a list again, which we also just saw. And in that list, we have a list of objects. In this list, we have objects, and those contain to-dos. So one to-do is do groceries. Another to-do is go running. And a third to-do is take a shower. We have a second array with users. One with the name Patrick and the other with the name Thomas. And let's make that a bit more beautiful or clean as you wish. And lastly, we have this function get important to-dos. So what we're going to do is we want to filter. We basically want to return the important to-dos, and we want to do that in a way that we want to use it on a website, for example. So we want to get the to-dos that are not completed. We want to get the to-dos that have a priority level 2. And we also want to return them in a way that I'm actually thinking whether we should discuss this because this might overcomplicate it. Let's just do this. We just want to get important to-dos. The great thing about the function get important to-dos is that it's already using a higher order function. It's using something called filter. Well, I do if I see something that I don't understand yet, I go to MDM and I'm just trying to find filter. Oh, and we are already on the page of filter. And basically what it tells me is that the filter method creates a new array with all elements that pass the test implemented by a provided function. Okay. The filter method creates a new array with all elements that pass the test implemented by the provided function. Okay. So here in this example, we see the array words, a filter is applied, and only the words will be returned in a new array that pass the test. Word.length should be higher than 6. And that's exactly what we're seeing right here. All the words that are not longer than 6 characters are simply not returned. So how is that going to look in our example? We don't want, we only want items from the to-dos to be returned if they are not completed. We want them to have a high priority level. So let's check. They shouldn't be completed. So in that respect, only the first 2 objects we expect to be returned. And the priority level needs to be 2. So based on that logic, I expect only the first object to be returned if everything works as expected. Now, in terms of clean code, there is something which we could do. Let's first test our code because that will help to have certainty that this will work. So just gonna make some new stuff. Yeah, I'm not very happy with the use of const here. That might be a bit confusing in the beginning. These are basically just variables. So let's just call them variables. And okay, well, there are no syntax errors. So let's see whether this is doing something. It's doing something, and in fact, it's returning the element called, or the object containing a title glossaries. And I think that's also what we just discussed. Based on the completion and the priority level, we expect the first element to be returned. Well, this is great. But I think the second aspect that we want to look into is now, okay, can we make this maybe more readable? And in fact, we can. And that's one of the strengths of functions in JavaScript. What we could say is something like, instead of all this code here, we could simply paste that and cut it and paste it here. And then say something like, is to do is important to do. Yeah. Now let's see. We can say, okay, function to do is important. Takes into to do. And it's returning this. Now we are basically encapsulating the logic of whether a to-do is worth returning or not, or worth filtering in another function which we store in here. To-do is important. And it's going to assess two conditions, namely, is the to-do completed, and whether it is priority level 2. Let's test this code. So let's see. Will it accept if we reassign those? I think it will. Okay, get, no, not get important to-dos, users. And look, we still have the same output. So in terms of output, nothing changed. But let's see whether we can see the difference here. Instead of having, let's say, a longer line and more logic in the get important to-dos function, we now store that in another function. Yeah, so that makes our code more readable. It makes the code more minimal, and it will help us to maintain the code. It will help us to test the code. So this is considered a good and clean practice in JavaScript. So then I want to show you one last example of the function. Let's see, of cleanly coding a function. Yes, but perhaps, because I see we're already about 30 minutes presenting, I think it's more important to show you other stuff. Yeah, let's skip this one. I think there's one more example. I can shortly describe what it's doing. I think another example I found on the web was about a function called getCollectionWeight. And basically the author managed to refactor or minimize his code in a really smart way. Here in the step 0, basically, the length of his function was about 22 lines. And in the second step, he already manages to minimize that same function to 15 lines. And I think he actually proceeds and makes it even shorter. Perhaps, yeah, we will share this article. I can already mention how this article is called, The Art of Writing Small and Plain Functions. I can highly recommend it to read it. Perhaps Raquel can share it in the channel. But I think this is a really beautiful article that shows how, yeah, you can minimize your code. So let's go back to, let's zoom out. So cleanly functionalizing code. Functions should be small. Functions can harness readability. which is what we just saw. And very much related to that is that they should do one thing. As long as they do one thing, we are clear on its output. It will be more clear to read, and it will be, again, it will be more testable. And, oh, no, let me just show you something I encountered the other day. Really great student, actually already got hired at a firm, and well, I really admire her coding qualities. But during the course, I actually commented because at some point I saw that she was returning true in a few same lines, or not the same lines, but within a few lines, and basically. Yeah, like if you see something like this, you really need to start thinking, is this necessary? Like, do we really need to return twice a true statement? And do we even need this whole if condition if it will return true anyways? So that's also one good practice with programming. Always check whether there's duplication. And if there's duplication, try to research whether it can be minimized or whether you need it at all. Then there's one last aspect. Oh no, there is another aspect that I want to show you, which is regarded important in clean functionalizing code, and that is something called side effects. Well, that's still quite an abstract claim, and yeah, I did not encounter that very early in your career, but at some point when you get the responsibility of creating a whole service yourself, it's regarded not optimal to create functions that have side effects. And what are side effects? Well, basically, well, let's look at this example. We have a function called check password. It's, by the way, written in Python, so it's a different language, but again, same principles. It's checking the password based on a username and password, and then it's trying to find the user based on that username. If the user.password is not the password, which is provided, there is a method called increase wrong attempt, which is attached to the user. This might seem logical if, for example, check password is attached to the login mechanism, right? Like if somebody tries to log in and the password is incorrect and you want to store in your database that there was a wrong attempt, fantastic. By all means, yeah, increase that wrong attempt. But the problem here is if that's really your only intent, then it's in the naming. Because this naming suggests that it's checking a password, and that can be in multiple instances. Imagine you want to validate later on whether a password was correctly provided. That's not a wrong attempt anymore. And still, if you would check the password and it would be wrong, the increased wrong attempt will be called, and that's a side effect. So it's an effect that is actually not applicable to each situation, that you would logically deduct from the name of that function, and that's regarded dangerous. So in a clean code practice, one would advise to not put this in the function check password, but in a separate function called is wrong attempt. Perhaps based on the output of check password, right? Like if check password returns false, it means that the password provided was false. Then you could create another function called increase wrong attempt, and call it afterwards. But that's a really different structure than encapsulating it within that other function. All right, the last thing I would like to tell you about the cleanly functionalizing code is that functions should have a descriptive name, and that it does not need to be short. So if we check out the following, we see here a few function names: write to order XML file, or create new part product. Function names are can be very long, and that's actually not a wrong practice. It's actually really fine to specifically describe what's happening in a function. The only thing that to keep in mind is that if you have a very long function description, you might wonder, well, does it need to be so specific? And is it maybe possible to abstract this functionality? Are there other places where I do something likewise? Yeah, but in general, it's really fine to very specifically describe what you're doing with a function. I would like to suggest to take a short break. So it's 8:42 now. I think 5 minutes would be good, just to get some tea or coffee or anything what you're drinking. So yeah, let's get back at 6:48 CET, if that's all fine with you.
Hey, welcome back. Everyone, I just want to remind you all that if you can ask your questions on the Ask a Question section, that'd be great. And we will have a Q&A in the end, a live Q&A for you to answer a few questions, for us to answer a few questions from you, if you still have doubts during the webinar. And for those of you asking, this webinar is recorded, so if you need to review this, it will be in this same link. Okay? I saw that some of you asked. All good, Thomas? No? No sound? You are muted.
Hello?
Hey.
Are you trying to get your sound back, maybe, Thomas? Yeah.
Can you refresh the page?
All right.
Hey,
Yeah.
all good. Perfect.
Page. Yeah, that worked.
You can share
All
your
right.
screen again.
That's a very good one. Yeah. All right. All right. So let's go back to the initial plan of the lecture. So no, I don't want that. So yeah, we just did functions. We just discussed the cleanly coding of functions, and the rest of the lecture will be talking about naming, code formatting, and some principles. I think while the principles can be a bit abstract, but especially the middle three, they are a bit less of a deep dive in JavaScript than the functions. So they will be more practical regarding, okay, this is how you place a comment. This is when you can place a comment. And this is when you, I don't know, this is how you format your code. So it will be a bit less of syntax that you might not be familiar with. Yeah, I think that's worth mentioning after diving into the function part. Let's see. Yeah, I think we discussed enough function part. Yeah. All right. How to cleanly name code. I think this is another very important part because in the end, I think Gary Bush described clean code as, well, resembling well-written prose. And this is, I think, the part that will dive into that that aspect. So how to cleanly name code. Well, most importantly, names should be meaningful and they should be correct. They should be intention revealing. They should be distinctive and they should be searchable. This is a list. You could even abbreviate it, but honestly, these are the things that I think are most important for now. There are more aspects. You could make a list of 10 or 20 of these characteristics or criteria, but I think these like 4 aspects of cleanly naming things are, well, perhaps most worth diving into right now. So let's go first to the naming, correct name. And let me go once again to a submission of a student. Yeah. So I encountered this code during previous bootcamp, during last bootcamp, and basically the assignment was to get a random, well, to write a method wherein a Viking is attacking. Perhaps it's actually better to show you the assignment for a little second. Yeah, I think that's actually, because then we're clear on what I want to show you. Okay. Okay. So, well, we're basically now looking into an Ironhack lab. This is how, how many assignments in the bootcamp look like. So basically, there is, like a general theme, like JS Viking, things, object-oriented programming. The content of this assignment is something like program a war between Vikings and Saxons, and in an object-oriented way. And one of the sub-assignments was to code the Viking attack. So let me just read this out loud so we get an idea of what we're actually looking at. A Saxon chosen at random has their received damage method called with the damage equal to the strength of a Viking, also chosen at random. This should only perform a single attack and the Saxon doesn't get to attack back. So then let's look to that code. Viking attack. And let's look to line 73. We don't need to look to much more. We can just look to line 73. And I see that a variable, a type of variable, namely let, is declared, let Saxon. And the value of Saxon is retrieved with a function called random index. Random index, and the Saxon army is submitted. And there's something strange about this. And the strange part is that if I read this, a Saxon has their received, a Saxon chosen at random. If I read that a Saxon needs to be chosen at random and thus needs to be retrieved, that doesn't resemble this method. Then let's look into what random index is doing. Function random index takes in an array, and it's basically getting a random index of that array. So what this method is actually doing is not getting a random index. It's getting a random warrior, and in this case, a random Saxon. So that's what I mean with, well, when you name something, it needs to be correct. Be very mindful of how you name something, because maybe for yourself, while you are, like hacking your way through an assignment, this makes sense. But if I read this and I see that a random index is assigned to a variable called Saxon, it doesn't make sense. So that's, the very first plain advice: correctly name anything in your code. Then we have these three guys: intention revealing, distinctive, searchable. And I think we have examples for that in Java. And those are basically examples of code that exists in the real world, but that do not really resemble or seem to be in line with clean coding principles. So, for example, we here have a variable of type integer, d. And in an application, this is supposed to mean the elapsed time in days. And well, here we have a similar example, but then elapsed time in seconds is basically conveyed by one letter, namely S. And according to clean code principles, this is not a very well conveying of your intention or of the meaning of that very variable. So what you could do instead of a D, you could say elapsed time in days. You're just writing it out. Or, well, these are other examples: days since creation, file age in days, days since modification. Basically, programming languages allow you to just name it the way you want it. You don't need to limit yourself to a single character. And yeah, it's regarded a good practice to actually convey the meaning, convey the intention. Then there's another aspect of cleanly, or yeah, like cleanly naming aspects or code, which has to do with distinctiveness. So some names, they are very generic, like product info, product data. Okay, imagine you have a huge application and you see this, you see a class or a variable, product info or product data. You're very likely to dive deeper into what the hell does that mean. So perhaps we're talking about product attributes, or we're talking about product events, or we're talking about product costs. You can be much more specific in your name than something like product info or product data. So distinctiveness is also a very important part of clearly and cleanly naming your code. Then the last criteria that is mentioned in the slide is make it searchable. If you call your variable, or for example, you call your variable max, and it should refer to max students per teacher. Imagine you are searching for that variable in your application. An application might have a few hundred files, so there's a big chance that you are going to have a lot of hits, which will basically search hits, which will basically cost you more time to find the right variable. And if in the worst case, it's just, you can have hundreds of hits or even thousands. So I can highly advise you to really care about making your variable searchable. So instead of max, using max students per teacher. And then if you would use a command line tool called grep for searching strings and files, you would actually find it like one hit or a few instead of a few hundred. Let's see. Yeah, so that's the cleanly naming of things. Then let's go and let's take a look at how to cleanly comment code. This is also one of the most frequent mistakes or less clean code what I've seen in Ironhack submissions. So I think the base principle with commenting is don't do it unless, okay? Because you have a very strong tool in your hands, namely a programming language. So a lot of meaning can be conveyed simply by naming your variables and functions and anything you can name correctly. So try to just put it to process meaning in code. And for some exceptions, you can consider actually using comments, and I will go into that. But let me first give you 2 bad examples using comments. Well, I think I call this redundant, and I think it is redundant. Perhaps not if you're learning how to code, but you wouldn't like to see this in production code or at a company. For example, here we have methods, which is a comment, and it's supposed to tell us that a tag is a method. But anybody who understands a class in JavaScript will understand that this is a method. So it's completely redundant unless, it's very valuable to you by means of learning. But then you could still wonder whether you want to include that in your code that you're sharing with the world. Another example here, we have a comment called Viking, whereas on the next line, we're declaring a class Viking. So this is not necessary. It's not, well, I wouldn't call it horrendous or horrible, or it's not like a really huge mistake, but ideally you just don't include it because it's just not necessary. Yes, then we have another example with unused. Oh yeah, that's also a thing. So sometimes what I also see with submissions is that basically a piece of code is not used anymore, or maybe it's temporarily not used. Maybe that person is unsure whether the new code will work, but then it's still being submitted. Whereas, well, for an Ironhack assignment, that might not be a big deal, but imagine you would share this with your fellow developers. Imagine a fellow developer would see this code years after you produced it. Maybe you can still explain it, maybe you can't. But it's definitely, yeah, for a new developer, or for another developer, it's absolutely not clear what to do with this, unless that person would go through all the code and conclude it's not necessary at all. So ideally, don't comment this stuff, just delete it if you know you can delete it. Then there are a few exceptions to the rule that just do not use comments. You can put it to do in code. That's actually regarded a good practice. Yeah, this can also really benefit the health of your application because, well, you and your developers will be reminded that something very important needs to be done. This is, yeah, considered fine. There are cases where comments can be informative and where it's hard to convey the meaning of what your output is, for example, in the naming of a method of a variable. For example, if you have a method called getTimestamp and that timestamp is in a specific date format, yeah, it wouldn't hurt to just place a comment and to show what date format you're using. So in those specific cases, it can actually be really useful to have an informative comment. Then the last example where it's actually very handy is if you're using it for API documentation. So there's something called, well, this is an example. You have multiple packages that do this, but there's something called JSDoc. And basically, you put a comment in your code above a function, for example, which you want to document, which means that you want to display it on an HTML page for other developers or even for yourself. You define some information there regarding the function that you're writing. And for example, the parameters, what type those parameters are, what the parameter is, and a description. And then in an HTML page, it will look something like this. I thought I had an example here, but I might not. That's unfortunate. Okay, what I can tell you is that basically this will be compiled to HTML. And that can be very handy because every time you make a function or you create or edit a function, you can edit that documentation like right next to that function, and it will be compiled to HTML. So yeah, that will make your code more maintainable. All right. Then the next question is how to cleanly format code. This is basically about vertical and horizontal formatting. And yeah, this has a few aspects. So for example, I'm sorry, just a sip. The lines quantity, that's the quantity of lines. Yeah, some people say that, for example, a file is not supposed to be longer than 60 lines. I think this is a bit, it really depends on your application. So I cannot say something very definite about this. Perhaps open is more of an interesting concept. So openness refers to the vertical spacing between pieces of code, and some people or developers or students submit code that is not very well vertically open. So it's just very close to each other. You see, like it's, yeah, like ideally you see a bit more spacing. So if you would, you know, if I just go to a JavaScript file, I call it vertical spacing iteration 2. Like ideally, for example, between these variables, just create some space. Indentation is also not very well. Yeah, just added some indentation. But yeah, this is, I think, the best example. Like here, between your variables and your function, you would usually create some openness because it makes it just much more readable. So yeah, that's what they mean with openness. Then there's something called relatedness. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's again referring to the openness, but the submission here actually shows a more well, also a way of basically ignoring the relatedness of pieces of code. So if we just paste this here, we see that a for loop is coded, and there's just two blank lines here, or empty lines, if you will. And they're absolutely not necessary, and they basically break the relatedness of lines of code, because this for loop is super related to each other. It's just a for loop. So why would you have two empty lines or even more here? That's basically making the code less readable and less understandable, because why? it's just yeah, it breaks the pattern of having related code close to each other. So that's what I would like to share with you related to the vertical formatting. And there's also the horizontal formatting. And well, the first aspect of that is like, how long should a line be? And I think what I read is that between 80 and 120 characters is regarded all right. Like 120 is kind of regarded the max, because some people have small screens, and yeah, you want most people to just be able to read your code without scrolling horizontally. So yeah, stick to 80 to 120, I would say. Indentation is also a very important thing. Like I think we already saw that, but you know, like if you see this, that's not very well indented. So please be very aware of how you indent your code. It really makes it much more readable, because it again says something about the relation of pieces of code to each other. And lastly, the spacing. Yeah, I think that's also described in this guide. Let's see. Oh no, let's reload it. White space. You can do it. No? All right, then we try it ourselves. Okay. So yeah, there are rules related to how to indent, how to use spacing between functions, within function declarations. For example, here, you see here's a space between the parentheses and the opening curly bracket. These can all be found in the Airbnb style, JavaScript style guide, which will also be shared. Perhaps Raquel can share those in the channel. But yeah, that's also an important part of styling your code in a readable way. And I think one thing that that is worth mentioning for those of you that already work with Visual Studio, but it's also available in other text editors, is that there's an option in those editors which is called format document, and it's basically doing a lot of work for you. Yeah, so if you have a lot of messy code, it basically just formats it. It takes care of indentation, it takes care of line length. This is really a great, yeah, tool when you are when you're coding. You can even, I think the code formatter that I'm using is prettier. You can go to the settings, and there you can find something like, let's say line. Here you can define what is your line limit. So I just share with you that between 80 and 120 lines, that like characters, that's kind of the range that is considered clean. Well, I think 80 is great, but by all means, if you think 120 is great or 100, that's also something you can something which you can define here. All right, then. Yeah, lastly, I would like to name some principles, and I think that maybe we can do a few questions to round up the lecture. Clean code principles, well, what I already showed you is name diligently. Be very aware of the way you name things, because you are going to reread your code, your fellow developers will read your code, and also developers in the future will read your code. So it's very important to convey the meaning of what you're doing with your program. Secondly, care about style. Again, this is a link to the Airbnb JavaScript style guide. The web development bootcamps in Ironhack are JavaScript. Actually, I think every web development bootcamp will be in JavaScript. So JavaScript is very important. And yeah, so, and also the styling in JavaScript when you're working in web development. So I can highly recommend you to check out this style guide. It's full of very handy advice when it comes to the way you write your code in many aspects. Then let me just mention 3 principles. Don't repeat yourself, which we already discussed. KISS, which means keep it simple, stupid. And yeah, which is basically keep it as simple as possible. Try to make it minimal, which is very much related to the clean code principles we earlier discussed. And code modular. This is basically what we've seen with when we discussed cleanly coding functions, because the more you make it modular, the more you use sub functions, the more readable your code will get, and the more maintainable it will be. So think also about modularity. That's very important. And the last thing that I would like to mention is be consistent. Yeah, like there are many ways to be consistent, but also to be inconsistent in coding. So if you choose a specific type of naming, for example, your classes in the styling, you can camel case it, you can Pascal case it. There are multiple types of casing. All those options can be fine, but be consistent with it. So if you start camel casing, keep doing that. If you start Pascal casing, keep doing that. Don't break the consistency there. Same goes in the naming. Once you start to use fetch for getting something, yeah, it can be handy to use that fetch word in your application or get. But also in terms of language, you can think about consistency versus inconsistency. So please be mindful about that. Yeah, so I think the last thing I wanted to share is, well, what does this clean code look like in the real world? Well, I think in the firm where I worked before, yeah, like it's not like there was agreement always about what clean code was, but there was definitely agreement that it was important. So we did have discussions about according to what standards we would code. And at some point, I think we never documented it, but we had agreement on what a clean document, a clean JavaScript file looked like. And I think in many companies, you have this agreement. It might be laid down in a document or not, but either way, if you are deviating from the styling and clean coding practices, you will definitely get to notice once you submit your code and it's being reviewed. So it might be very handy to be mindful about that aspect. Adding to that, it's actually really company specific. So perhaps in each company, you will see 70% of what I just discussed. You will see it back, but there might be aspects where it's deviating. So that's something also good to be mindful about. Yeah, I think that's really what I wanted to talk about today, what I would have liked to share with you related to clean code. So if there are any questions, I'm very happy to hear a question.
Hi again. So everyone, how did you feel about the webinar? Was it easy to follow along? Can you do you still need to share, Thomas, or can I close the sharing? All right. So we have time for a few questions still. If you still have them, I believe that Malcolm answered most of them during the webinar.
Yeah, there is one that I haven't really had a chance to answer. Maybe Thomas can look into that one.
So in here, Thomas, you have a question from Vic. How can I avoid falling back on a bad habits when the deadline is fast approaching? Yes, lean and prettier do the magic, but I'm making a few large functions instead of many smaller ones.
Interesting. So the question is how to prevent to fall back into the bad habit under time pressure, basically.
Yeah.
That's a very good question. In my experience, it can be tempting to basically submit something when it works, but I also experience that it can backfire, because as long as your code is not well styled or well named, or there are still details that are just off in relation to the company policy, it will not be appreciated. So then it can actually be better to be honest with your lead developer and tell him or her that you're close, but you simply want to work on, like finalizing your code in terms of readability. That can actually be better than sticking your hand, sticking your head in the sand. That's at least a saying in the Netherlands, and hoping that it will be fine.
Well, I hope
that's
that
what I would share.
That's perfect.
Sorry?
That's good advice. I hope that answered, Vic. I was telling you
to
say in the chat if this is what you're looking for. I hope that answered. That's good advice. It's always good to have something that's more presentable for other people to look into the code and for you to be comfortable with. I see that the most of the questions were answered during the webinar. So if you still want to make a few questions, that's fine. Just want to remind you that in here on the Ask a Question section, there's a link for the presentation that Thomas shared here today. So all the links that were shared during the presentation, all the resources that you saw that Thomas shared, let me know if you shared something a little bit like besides the links that you have in the presentation that you want to share now, Thomas. But in any case, the presentation is here if you need to take a look. And it will be available after we finish this webinar. So for those of you asking, the webinar is recorded and it will be available here through this link. So you just need to come here as if you were attending again. All right? Do you want to add anything before we go? Because I believe we have no questions. Malcolm and Thomas.
I just want to thank you guys for your attention, and I really enjoyed sharing this with you. And like what Raquel said, like please check out the lecture if you still have any questions. And I think you're very welcome to contact me, and I think Malcolm would also be happy to help you if you have a question. So let us know if there's something that's still that pops up later.
Yes. Oh
yeah, for sure. I don't have anything else to add more than what Thomas just said. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you guys for attending.
Just we have one last question from Elisa, and we're going to close with this one because it's a very generic one. So I think it would be good advice. What would you advise a total newbie on how to start in learning to code?
Wow.
How to start? Yeah, just start. Yeah, well, I mean, okay, so very generic answer, I guess, but just like, yeah, start. YouTube's your friend. Get a system at home, make some mistakes, I would start there. And then, of course, check out Ironhack for all the cool webinars that are coming up.
Yes, that's a good answer. There are a few webinars coming up. Always every month we have beginner webinars. So if you want to start there, usually they're very practical and you can code along. Also, maybe you can look into some online resources like Free Code Camp. I'm not sure if you want to give more. I will leave here the link to you, but as Malcolm was saying, you just have to start. I think that's it, right? All right. So I think that we'll close this here today. Thank you for the feedback, guys. I'm not sure if you're seeing this, Malcolm and Thomas, but everyone was able to follow along. I'm really happy with that, even if you were just starting. So I really hope this was useful to all of you. We're here today, and I hope to see you in upcoming webinars. And thank you to both of you, of course. All right, have a lovely evening, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.